Hello headbangers, it's your local Thrash Panda Slayer here. As you can pretty obviously tell, I'm a pretty big fan of metal music and have been for quite some time. It all goes back to my childhood. The first metal song I heard was either Enter Sandman playing on classic rock radio, or that one Pantera instrumental, Pre-Hibernation, which was featured on that one episode of SpongeBob back in the day. For that latter song, I was like 3 or 4 years old and had never heard anything like it before. It was so gritty and aggressive, and shockingly, I absolutely loved hearing it when I was a wee little lad. Although much of my exposure to heavy metal, and by extension punk rock, was through video games. And that brings me to today's subject, metal soundtracks in video games. This could either mean two things: original video game soundtracks that are primarily composed of metal music, or licensed soundtracks that contain at least a decent amount of metal in them. I will start off by covering original metal OSTs in gaming, and what better way to start off than with Doom. Doom was not the first video game OST to feature metal in it, or at least whatever 8-bit attempts at metal composers came up with, but it was the first mainstream game to have an original score that was largely composed of metal. This was 1993, so the tracks were composed using MIDI, and many of them were either heavily inspired by real-life metal tunes, if not outright covers of them. Still, this soundtrack fit the gameplay and atmosphere like a glove, and is still one of gaming's most iconic soundtracks. As the 5th generation of consoles arrived, and CD technology became the norm for consoles, not you, soundtracks that were composed in the studio with actual instruments became increasingly common, and so did licensed soundtracks, but we'll get there. id Software's successor to Doom, Quake, would feature an ambient industrial soundtrack composed by the one and only Trent Reznor. You may have heard him from a little obscure band called, I don't know, 9 Inch Nails. Quake 2, on the other hand, would go all out with a full-blown metal score. This one took cues from the industrial and groove metal sounds of the time, and was sonically speaking, a major step up from the MIDI metal of Doom. Not gonna lie, even though I have barely played this game until recently, the original soundtrack is legit one of the best metal scores I've heard in a video game. It's absolutely fantastic and even somewhat underrated. One last metal OST from the 90s, and this one might actually be my favorite, F-Zero X. I don't hear enough people talk about this one. This is low-key a contender for the greatest metal soundtrack in a video game, period. It's just so good. Given the frantic and speedy nature of the F-Zero games, this one goes for a speed and thrash metal score that utilizes ultra-high quality MIDIs for the time, and they still hold up even now. The guitars sound nice and crunchy, with plenty of frantic solos sprinkled in there as well. The drums are fast and intense. It just fits the vibe of the game perfectly. Seriously, go get yourself an N64 and a copy of this game, or just emulate it. Maybe grab a Monster Energy while you're at it, and play through this game. It is one of the funnest racing games out there. Skipping forward to the 2000s, and to a game that you did not expect to have a metal soundtrack, 2008's Call of Duty World at War. Yes, a World War II shooter features a soundtrack in a genre that did not exist at the time, and surprisingly, yes, it works. You see, unlike previous World War II shooters, World at War does not go for the usual themes of honor or heroism, but rather emphasize the brutality and ruthlessness of the war. World War II killed a total of like 70 million people. The war was anything but pretty, and that's reflected in this game having a fairly advanced gore system for 2008. People's limbs will get blown off from explosives and even high-caliber guns. It's not for the faint of heart. To complement this brutality are some metal tunes that can safely be described as proto-Djent. Ah, 2008, when having 7 and 8 string guitars in metal was a fresh thing, and not completely worn into the ground by hundreds of unimaginative imitators. On top of that, the famous COD Zombies mode had original metal tunes that could be played by finding Easter eggs. These also had vocals and lyrics, sung by a female vocalist, Elena Siegman, am I pronouncing that correctly? I stopped playing COD after Black Ops 2, and with good reason. Just look at the series now. You know what they say, once you go Black Ops, there ain't no going back ops. But man, all the hipsters at the time just didn't realize how good COD actually was in those days. And these old Zombies tracks are just part of the reason why. Moving into the 2010s and beyond, there are 2 electronic metal soundtracks that I would like to give attention to, and both very famous and iconic. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance and Doom 2016 and Eternal. I'll start off with the former, 1, since it's an older game and I want to go in chronological order, and 2, because just like COD Zombies, this game has vocal metal tracks, which adds an additional layer of intrigue to the score. The soundtrack was composed by Jamie Christopherson, you know, the guy who made the Toontown Online soundtrack. Along with him were a massive array of rock and metal musicians who did the vocals and guitars. These tracks were then remixed multiple times to give that futuristic electronic undertone that fits the vibe of the game. I think the most brilliant thing about this soundtrack is how the lyrics fit the theme of the bosses and story. This game really just wouldn't be the same if it had featured a more generic soundtrack. Lastly, we're returning to Doom, or Doom 2016 as it's often called. Mick Gordon was brought on to compose the soundtrack for this one, and originally this soundtrack was supposed to feature no rock or metal, but an electronic soundtrack that was forced by committee. However, Mick Gordon kept sneaking in guitar into the soundtrack until the Suits and Ties finally approved more metal being in the soundtrack. The anti-rock agenda of the 2010s was real, folks. Thank God he managed to defeat that crap. Still, there is an obvious electronic leaning to much of the soundtrack, which ended up in the final product. Doom Eternal and Doom the Dark Ages would feature more metal on the soundtrack, thankfully. The metal tunes in all of these modern Doom games lean towards a style known as Djent, which was one of, if not the biggest style of metal between the late 2010s and very early 2020s, and overwhelmingly utilized 8 or even 9 string guitars. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I think this style of metal has outstayed its welcome, and has made modern metal increasingly stale. I mean, given how much of Djent only uses the extra 2 or 3 strings on those wacky guitars of theirs, they might as well just cut off the other 6. Regardless, this style of metal combined with the electronic and industrial undertones really fits the brutal gameplay and atmosphere of the modern Doom games, and are undoubtedly the best that Djent had to offer. Moving on to the other side of metal soundtracks, licensed soundtracks. Metal was featured on many licensed game soundtracks in the 2000s. One that isn't completely talked about, but managed to get me into hard rock and metal, were the PS2 GTA games. 3 doesn't count since that game, for whatever reason, doesn't even have a rock station whatsoever. But Vice City and San Andreas featured stations dedicated to the 80s and 90s rock scenes. Vice City had V-Rock, which primarily had traditional heavy metal like Priest and Maiden, gay LA metal like Quiet Riot and Motley Crue, and even a few thrash metal hits to add some spice. This station was one of my earliest exposures to metal, from a game that I was way too young to be playing back in those days. San Andreas featured 2 rock stations, KDST and Radio X. The latter, while not really being subgenre specific, did have a few metal bangers, such as Mother by Danzig, Hellraiser by Ozzy, rest in peace, and Cult of Personality by Living Colour, my favorite black metal band. GTA 4's episodes actually featured some extreme metal on the LCHC station, which was dedicated to hardcore and crossover thrash in the standalone game. This was the one and only time death and black metal would feature in a GTA game, which is a shame. 5 would only feature a SoCal punk station, which I liked at the time since I was in my early to mid-teens, and was just getting into playing guitar. But as I've grown older, I more appreciate the complexity and songwriting of metal over a lot of punk bands. Saints Row, a series that could have been the silver to GTA's gold had it not been for its sad decline into aliens and hipsters, had some brilliant metal stations in 2 and 3. The Crunch, which was known as the Blood in 3, had plenty of late 2000s and early 2010s metal, so obviously a lot of metalcore, but it's the good stuff, not that octane core crap that we've been dealing for like the past decade or so. The first time I heard like legit death metal, and not whatever The Simpsons thinks is death metal, was while playing Saints Row 2 back in like 09 or 2010 or something. As a kid, the screamy, shrieky vocals genuinely scared me at first, and I only liked some of the songs on the station for that reason. But like every tried and true metalhead, I grew to like it, and now harsh vocals don't faze me at all. Sadly, Saints Row 4, which is the second worst Saints Row game if you don't count Gat Out of Hell, and I'll stand by that take, well, it only featured like 2 metal songs at all, and they're not even that heavy. I mean, we're talking about In Flames after they went alt metal after all. I don't know, I heard that Hipsters Row had a Slayer song on it, but screw it. I'm not going to talk about that horrible abomination of a game. Guitar Hero is a pretty obvious example of licensed metal in video games, being a rhythm-based game with a guitar peripheral. This game notoriously made Dragon Force a household name, and introduced thousands of kids in the 2000s to rock and metal bands that would quickly become lifelong faves. It probably also got a lot of people to pick up an actual guitar, which, not gonna lie, is a lot more fun than playing Guitar Hero. I've been playing guitar since I was 13, and it's a very fun and zen thing to do when you've got nothing else to do. But speaking of Neversoft titles, we gotta talk Tony Hawk. Aside from just being a blast to play with their tight controls and stellar level design, they were accompanied by a soundtrack that featured lots of punk and metal tunes. I did call this metal soundtracks in games, but I might as well talk punk too while we're at it. Tony Hawk games featured tons of punk songs, ranging from the OG 70s and early 80s stuff, crossover thrash like Suicidal Tendencies, yes YouTube, I just said a word you don't like, deal with it, and even some 90s and 2000s pop punk. These games were my entry into the world of punk, getting me into bands such as Agent Orange, Dead Kennedys, and the Ramones. But the mid-2000s games did not skip out on the balls-out metal. The Underground games and American Wasteland had plenty of great metal, such as Entombed, Venom, High on Fire, and Mastodon. Underground 1 even featured some Kiss, including the band members as unlockable characters. Granted, this doesn't really fit the theme of the game to be honest, but it's cool if you're a fan of Kiss. Lastly, I cannot forget about Brutal Legend. Not only a game with a metal soundtrack, but literally a game about metal music. I'm shocked I haven't played this game until now. It really seems like something I would have played years ago. Either way, this game features a very large and diverse selection of metal from many different subgenres. Well, except for nu metal and metalcore. Hell, this game openly mocks said genres in the intro. I have to admit, Cabbage Boy almost feel like one of those modern pop metalcore bands like Bad Omens or Sleep Token. You know, the ones who basically just play pop music but with distortion. Feels a bit prophetic in a way. Maybe one day I'll do a full review on this game. I just haven't played enough to get a proper judgment yet. Either way, it seems like something almost every metalhead should try out. Now sadly, I have noticed that licensed metal scores and just metal in general, it simply became a lot less common in games after 2012 or so. There was like a Judas Priest and a Megadeth song in Watch Dogs 2, and maybe a few others in some other games, but it's obvious that rock and metal weren't cool anymore, and that was reflected in rap, EDM, and pop becoming more common in games, and just culture in general. Let's not act like this trend wasn't forced by the powers that be. The fact that Mick Gordon originally had to fight just to get metal into a Doom game is proof of that. Now, I am partially to blame here, as I started losing interest in upcoming games during the 8th generation, and I still don't have a PS5 as of now, but it's still obvious that metal and just rock in general were not being catered to as much in games after 2012. Look at the recent NFS games and the utter shite that fills their soundtracks. Metal in video games really peaked during the 2000s, and I'm thankful to have grown up in the last great decade before media and society as a whole became wussified. Now, as for classic games, there are some metal soundtracks I skipped out on since I don't have all day here, and there are also soundtracks that only had a couple of metal tracks on them in general. I mainly wanted to talk about the standout scores that shaped many people's tastes. But for now, I think it's time to go get some rest. This video was something I had planned for years, but never even started work on until the past couple of months. Either way, it's great to get this passion project out of the way, and I hope everyone enjoyed.